The morning Henrietta Winslow walked into the sheriff's office in Caldwell, Kansas, with a leather satchel pressed tight against her chest and dust still clinging to the hem of her black mourning dress, she already knew that nobody in that building was going to help her. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who had been sitting too long at a poker table, worn down, suspicious, and not particularly interested in anything that might complicate the evening's arrangements. The cattle drives had made the town rich enough, and the men who ran it had grown accustomed to a certain kind of comfort that depended entirely on things staying exactly as they were. Henrietta was 31 years old, and she had been a widow for exactly 47 days. She had counted every one of them. Her husband, Thomas Winslow, had died in what the coroner had officially recorded as a riding accident on the southern edge of the Delacroix Range. A fall from his horse, near a ravine that everyone in town seemed to accept with a casual and convenient swiftness that set Henrietta's teeth on edge. She had not accepted it. She had gone to the land, and she had looked at the ground, and she had found what no one had bothered to look for, because the men who counted in Caldwell had already decided what had happened and had moved on. What she carried in that leather satchel was a bullet, a torn piece of fabric from a coat she recognized, a set of boot prints she had pressed into a plaster mold the way her schoolteacher father had once taught her, and a letter from Thomas that he had given to their neighbor, Mrs. Polk, sealed and marked to be opened only if something happened to him. Something had happened to him. She had read the letter 16 times. It named a man. It named a reason. And it described a scheme that involved the land Thomas had refused to sell, the man who wanted it, and the specific manner in which that man had communicated his intentions. The name in the letter was Clarence Delacroix, son of the ranching family that owned the better part of the southern county. Sheriff Dale Purvis was a big man with a carefully trimmed mustache and the kind of settled, heavy confidence that came from knowing exactly who his friends were and what they were worth. He sat behind his desk with his boots up and his coffee cooling beside him, and when Henrietta set her satchel on his desk and began to explain what she had found, she watched his expression move through a series of small adjustments that told her everything she needed to know. First, there was the polite patience that men offered women they did not intend to take seriously. Then there was a slight tightening around his eyes when she said Thomas had been shot. Then, when she said the name Delacroix, his face did something careful and deliberate that involved the corners of his mouth settling into a kind of professional blankness. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow, "your husband's horse spooked near that ravine. It's not the first time that stretch of land has taken a man down. I'm sorry for your loss. I truly am. But what you've got in that bag isn't evidence of anything other than a grieving woman looking for something to make sense of what happened." "He was shot," she said, and she kept her voice flat, and even because she had practiced this. "The bullet I recovered is a .44 caliber. Thomas was riding a trail he had ridden 100 times. His horse did not spook, and the letter he left with Mrs. Polk describes a conversation with Clarence Delacroix that happened 3 weeks before Thomas died, in which he was told in plain terms that the land deal would happen one way or another. Purvis looked at the satchel. He did not reach for it. He picked up his coffee instead. "Land disputes are civil matters, Mrs. Winslow, and finding a stray bullet on open range doesn't establish anything. I'm afraid I can't open an investigation based on what you've brought me." She looked at him for a long moment. She had known this was coming. She had told herself she would stay composed, and she was composed, but there was something cold and bright moving through her chest that she recognized as the particular fury of a woman who has been told, once again, that what she knows is not what she knows. "Then you won't look at it," she said. "I don't see cause," he said. She picked up the satchel. She turned to leave. There was one other person in the office that morning. He had been standing near the far wall the whole time, leaning against the doorframe between the main room and the corridor that led to the cells, his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head. He was tall, with a lean kind of build that suggested a man who worked hard and did not waste much, and he had the look of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors. Sun-darkened skin, lines at the corners of his eyes, hands that were large and calloused. He was somewhere around 35, and there was something quiet and settled about him that was different from the sheriff's settled quality. The sheriff's stillness was the stillness of comfort. This man's stillness was the stillness of someone who was paying very close attention. He was wearing a deputy's badge, though from the way he was positioned and the way Purvis had not once acknowledged him during the conversation, it was clear that his relationship with the office was something other than the usual arrangement. He pushed off the doorframe as she turned to leave. "I'd like to see what's in that bag, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and direct, without the careful management she had heard in the sheriff's. There was nothing apologetic in it and nothing patronizing. It was simply an honest statement of intention. She stopped. She looked at him. She did not know him. She knew most of the people in Caldwell well enough to place them, but he had a road-traveled quality about him, and she had been somewhat removed from the town's social life these past weeks for obvious reasons. "Why?" she asked, and it came out more blunt than she intended, but she was past the point of worrying about that. "Because the sheriff doesn't want to," he said, "and that's usually when something turns out to matter." Purvis shifted in his chair. "Kendrick," he said, and there was a warning in it. The man called Kendrick did not appear to hear it, or chose not to. He was looking at Henrietta with a direct, unhurried attention that was not the kind of attention that made women uncomfortable, but rather the kind that made them feel that what they said was actually being processed by someone behind the eyes. "Edgar Kendrick," he said, and he extended one of those large calloused hands to her. "I'm a deputy, though the term is used loosely. I ride for the county circuit mostly. I'm in Caldwell this week on other business, but I've got no particular loyalty to staying on that other business if something more pressing comes up." She looked at the hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and respectful. "Henrietta Winslow," she said. "I know who you are, Mrs. Winslow. I knew Thomas a little. He ran a good piece of land." Something moved through her at that, a brief tightening in her throat that she swallowed down. "Did you know him well?" "Not well," Edgar said honestly. "I passed through about 2 years back. He let me water my horse at his well and we shared a meal. He was a decent man, talked about that land like it was a member of his family." She looked at him steadily. "Then you know he would not have fallen from his horse on ground he knew like his own hands." Edgar looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. It was the look of a man who was making a decision. "Show me what's in the bag," he said. She set the satchel on the edge of Purvis's desk, which made the sheriff sit up straighter with a look of discomfort he was trying not to show. She opened it and laid out each item carefully, explaining each one as she went. The bullet, which she had dug from a fence post 12 feet from where Thomas had gone down, at an angle and trajectory that would have meant it came from the ridge to the east rather than from any fall. The piece of fabric, caught on a mesquite branch on the ridge itself, a distinctive dark green wool that she had seen many times on the back of Clarence Delacroix. The plaster mold of a boot print on the ridge showing the distinctive wear pattern on the left heel, and the letter which she unfolded and set beside the rest. Edgar read the letter carefully. He looked at the bullet. He held the plaster mold and turned it in the light from the window. "This boot print," he said. "You made this yourself." "My father taught me," she said. "He was a surveyor and something of a natural scientist. He said the ground always told the truth if you knew how to ask it." Something that was almost a smile crossed Edgar's face and disappeared. He looked at Purvis. "Dale," he said, "this is enough to at least put some questions to Delacroix." "It is not enough to do anything of the sort," Purvis said, and now the warmth was entirely gone from his voice. "Clarence Delacroix is a respected member of this community. His family has built half of what stands in this county. I'm not going to drag him into a widow's fantasy based on a piece of cloth and a bent bullet." The room was quiet for a moment. "A widow's fantasy," Henrietta repeated softly, and the softness of it was somehow the most dangerous thing in the room. Edgar set the plaster mold down carefully. "I'll look into it," he said. He said it to Henrietta, not to Purvis. Purvis stood up. "Kendrick, I am telling you as the duly appointed sheriff of this county." "You're telling me to ignore evidence in the death of a man," Edgar said, without raising his voice at all. "And I'm telling you that's not something I'm prepared to do. I don't work for you, Dale. I work for the circuit judge, and he's not going to be interested in the explanation that the Delacroix name made the evidence too inconvenient to look at." There it was, then. The thing in the room that nobody had said plainly. Purvis's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something cold and careful. "This will be the end of your relationship with this office," Purvis said. "That'll be all right," Edgar said. He gathered the evidence back into the satchel himself, handling each piece with care, and he handed the satchel to Henrietta. Their hands touched briefly at the exchange, her fingers against his, and she felt the warmth of that contact in a way that was startling and unwelcome, and entirely understandable given that she had been alone and afraid and furious for 47 days. "Walk with me," he said, and she walked with him out of the sheriff's office and into the dust and light of Caldwell's Main Street. The street was busy in the mid-morning way of cattle towns, a wagon being loaded outside the dry goods store, two cowboys from a drive that was passing through leaning against the rail of the saloon, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out in an even rhythm from 2 buildings down. The sky above was that particular high blue of Kansas in October, enormous and clear and entirely indifferent to the things happening beneath it. Henrietta stood on the boardwalk and breathed. "He's not going to help," she said. It was not really a question. "No," Edgar said. He stood beside her, watching the street with a quiet and systematic attention. "Purvis has been in the Delacroix family's pocket for 6 years at least. It's an open secret among the circuit riders. The judge in Wichita knows it. He's been waiting for something concrete enough to act on." Henrietta turned to look at him. "And is what I have concrete enough?" He considered this honestly, which she appreciated more than a quick reassurance would have been. "It's a start," he said. "The letter is strong. The fabric is circumstantial without a coat to match it to. The bullet tells us something, but a defense attorney would argue about trajectory all day. The boot print is good, but we'd need something to compare it to." "I know which boots those are," she said. "Clarence Delacroix had them made at Hargrave's boot shop in Wichita last spring. He wore them at the July 4th gathering. I noticed them because they were an unusual color of leather, and the heel was set crooked from the start. He complained about it to the bootmaker by letter, Mrs. Hargrave told me, because she thought it was funny." Edgar looked at her. There was something in his expression now that she had not seen in it before, something that was not just the professional appraisal of a lawman but something more personal, a kind of recognition, as if he was seeing her properly for the first time and was surprised by what he found. "You've been building this case yourself," he said. "For 47 days, she said, "because no one else was going to." He was quiet for a moment. The blacksmith's hammer rang out 3 times in the distance. "I'm going to help you," he said. "Not because it's my job, though it is my job, because it's right. And because Thomas Winslow let me water my horse and gave me a plate of beans on a cold evening and talked to me about his land with the kind of love that a man shouldn't have to die for." She had kept herself together through the confrontation with Purvis, through the laying out of the evidence, through everything. But something about the plainness of that, the simple human reason he gave, the memory of Thomas being folded in so carefully made her eyes sting. She looked away down the street because she did not want this stranger to see her cry, and then she changed her mind and looked back because she was tired of making herself smaller to make things easier for everyone else. He was not watching her with pity. He was watching her with respect. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady. He nodded once. "Are you staying in town?" "I've been at the boarding house on Elm Street. I rode in yesterday. I had hoped to be back on the land by tonight, but I don't know now." "Stay in town a day longer," he said. "I want to take a ride out to that ravine with you and see the site myself before anything else. The ground holds things longer than people think, but not forever." She agreed. She went back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room and felt, for the first time in 47 days, something that was not grief or fury or exhaustion. It was something smaller and quieter than hope, but it was in that direction. The following morning they rode out to the ravine together, and the act of being on horseback again, with the open land rolling out around her in the golden October light, did something complicated to Henrietta's chest. This was Thomas's country. She had learned to love it through him, had arrived as a Philadelphia schoolteacher's daughter who found the prairie vast and somewhat alarming, and had discovered over 7 years of marriage that the land had a grammar to it, that you had to learn to read, and that once you could read it you could not go back to anything smaller. She rode ahead of Edgar along the trail she knew, and when she glanced back at him once, she found him watching the landscape with the same kind of attentive reading that she had come to associate with the land literate. He was not simply looking. He was understanding. They reached the ravine and she stopped her horse on the near edge, as she had done a dozen times since Thomas died, forcing herself to look at it clearly. Edgar dismounted and walked the perimeter carefully, crouching at intervals, picking up a handful of dirt and letting it fall through his fingers. He climbed the eastern ridge on foot, moving steadily up through the scrub and the loose red rock, and she followed him. She had climbed it before, of course. She showed him where she had found the fabric. She showed him the depression in the rock where someone had lain, and the small clear area where the boot prints were before she had made her mold of the most complete one. Edgar crouched over the depression for a long time. He produced a small notebook and made careful drawings. He measured things using a length of cord he carried in his coat pocket. He worked with a thoroughness that she found both practically encouraging and, she noticed with a kind of guilty surprise, personally beautiful. "He waited up here a while," Edgar said, mostly to himself. "There's evidence of a meal." He pointed to a cluster of small bones, a rabbit long stripped tucked into the shadow of a rock. He came prepared to wait. This was not a thing done in anger, Henrietta said. It was something she had thought many times, but saying it aloud gave it a different quality. "No," Edgar agreed. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes steady under the brim of his hat. This was a business decision. The fury moved through her again, clean and hot. She had come to understand that her anger was not a failing. It was information. It was her body telling her that something was profoundly wrong with the world, and that she should not stop until it was made right. "We need to see the boots," she said. "We need to be smart about how we do it," he said. "Clarence Delacroix is not a stupid man. If we come at him directly, he disappears what needs to disappear and it's done. We need to confirm the boot match quietly, and then we need to take everything to Judge Whitmore in Wichita, not to Purvis. How do we see the boots?" He thought about this on the ride back. She could see him thinking, the way his jaw moved slightly and his eyes went to the middle distance. She found, to her own bewilderment, that she was learning his face already, cataloging its angles and expressions, and she made herself stop doing it because it was neither the time nor the appropriate response to a man she had met yesterday. The plan he devised was elegant in its simplicity. Edgar knew a man named Hector Villanueva who worked at the Delacroix Ranch as a horse handler. He had met him on the circuit and found him to be a man of integrity who had more than one reason to find the Delacroix family's behavior objectionable. Hector had grown up on land that the Delacroix family had absorbed by means that were, in the vocabulary of the Texas and Kansas range wars, entirely standard and entirely wrong. Edgar rode out to see Hector alone, leaving Henrietta at the boarding house with instructions to write down every detail she could remember about the appearance of the boots and the circumstances in which she had seen them. She wrote for 2 hours. She discovered that her memory, when properly interrogated, was considerably more precise than she had realized. She wrote about the boots in detail, the reddish-brown leather, the stitching pattern, the pronounced drop of the left heel that Clarence always compensated for by slightly favoring his right side when he stood, which she had always assumed was simply a man's habit and now understood as something more specific. She wrote about the gathering where she had seen them, who had been present, what had been discussed, and what she had observed of Clarence Delacroix that evening. His manner around Thomas, the particular kind of cold pleasantness he employed, the way he had looked at the land that stretched south of the gathering and spoken about the future of the county. When Edgar came back that evening, he had the look of a man who had received useful information and was turning it carefully. They sat at the small table in the boarding house's front parlor, because it was the only acceptable place for them to sit together that was neither a saloon nor a bedroom, and she spread her written notes across the table, and he read them while she watched him. Hector had confirmed that Clarence Delacroix had a pair of boots matching the description, made in Wichita, distinctive for the crooked left heel. Hector had seen them. More importantly, Hector had also seen Clarence leave the ranch early on the morning of the day Thomas died and return in the late afternoon, which was unusual, and had noticed that the boots Delacroix was particular about, his good boots, had come back with caliche dust on them of a type and color consistent with the eastern ridge above the ravine. "Hector will testify," Edgar said. "He knows the risk. He said he's been waiting for a reason." "It'll put him in danger," Henrietta said. "He knows that too," Edgar said. "He's a man who has made his peace with what doing the right thing costs." She looked at Edgar across the table, at the careful lines of his face in the lamplight, at the way he held his coffee mug with those large, careful hands. "And you," she said, "what does it cost you?" He looked up at her, and the directness of his gaze was something she felt physically, like a hand placed gently but firmly against her sternum. "Nothing I'm not willing to spend," he said. She looked down at her notes. The lamp between them flickered once in a draft from the window, and the light moved across the table and across her hands, and she was aware of the warmth of the room and of him sitting across from her. And she felt guilty about being aware of it, and then felt guilty about feeling guilty, and then decided that all of these feelings were things she could sort out later, when Thomas had his justice. "Tell me about yourself," she said, because she realized she knew almost nothing about him, and that seemed wrong, given that she was putting her dead husband's justice in his hands. "You ride circuit. That means you've been doing this a long time." He leaned back in his chair, and she had the impression that this was not a question he received often, or perhaps one he answered easily. 6 years, he said. "Before that I was a cattle drover. Before that I was a cavalry soldier, and before that I was a boy in Missouri with a father who ran a small farm and a mother who read to me every night until the farm failed and everything went to pieces in the usual ways." "The usual ways," she said. "The war," he said. "My father didn't come back from it. My mother held on for 5 years after, and then she didn't either. I was 19, and I figured the land was as good a direction as any other." She looked at him steadily. "You were cavalry." "7th, he said, and something crossed his face that was complicated and brief. "Under Custer for a while. I mustered out before the Little Bighorn. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me that I say it clearly. I was part of what was done to the people of these plains, and I carry that." The directness of it surprised her. It was not the kind of thing men said, as a rule. They usually folded it under the language of duty or necessity, or simply did not mention it at all. "I respect that you say it that way," she said quietly. He nodded. "The land out here was taken and is still being taken. What's happening to your husband's land in a smaller register is the same pattern. It's men with power deciding that what someone else built belongs to them because they want it more. I find I can't make my peace with it no matter the scale." She was quiet for a moment, genuinely struck by him. "Were you ever married?" she asked, and then immediately felt the presumption of it, but he did not seem to find it presumptuous. "No," he said. "I was going to be once. A woman named Ruth in Abilene. She decided she didn't want the life, which was a sensible decision that I've had sufficient time to appreciate. Do you regret it?" "I regret that I wasn't the kind of man she needed," he said. "I don't regret that she chose not to wait for me to become him." There was something in that, in the precision of the distinction, that told her a great deal about who Edgar Kendrick was. They left for Wichita the following morning, the three of them, Henrietta, Edgar, and Hector Villanueva, who met them at the edge of town at dawn with his horse packed, and his jaw set with a quiet determination that she found deeply moving. Hector was a compact, dark-eyed man in his late 30s who spoke with a careful formality that she suspected came from a lifetime of navigating spaces where Spanish-speaking men were not offered the benefit of the doubt. She treated him with the directness and respect she would have given anyone, and she saw him notice it and relax slightly. The ride to Wichita took the better part of 2 days, and they camped one night on the open prairie under a sky so full of stars that it looked almost artificial. She had slept under that sky before, on drives with Thomas, and it had the same effect it always had. It made the large things feel appropriately large, and the small things feel appropriately small, which was a useful recalibration. Edgar had made the camp efficiently and without fuss, fire built, horses tended, the simple meal of salt pork and hard biscuits and coffee that was the traveler's standard, prepared without complaint or theater. Hector had gone to sleep early, citing a headache, and Henrietta sat by the fire with Edgar in the enormous quiet of the Kansas night. "You're not afraid," he observed, looking into the fire. "Of what?" "Any of this." Most people, most women in particular, which I say not as a commentary on women, but as a commentary on what the world has required of them, most people would be frightened by all of it. The threat, the journey, the uncertainty. "I've been frightened every day for 47 days, she said. "I think there's a kind that works on you and there's a kind that works for you. The first kind makes you smaller. I decided not to let it." He looked at her then, and the firelight was on his face and she could see the way he was looking at her, and it was not a new thing exactly, but it was more concentrated than before, as if something had crystallized in him. "How did you and Thomas meet?" he asked. She smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that arrived before she could consider it, at the memory. "I was teaching school in Topeka," she said. He came in to register his younger brother, who was 17 and hadn't had any schooling to speak of. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he looked at me and he said, "Ma'am, my brother is a good deal bigger than your other students, and I want you to know in advance that he's not stupid. He's just missed his chances, and he'll be respectful." And I said, "I expect he will be, or he'll be educated about what my ruler is for." And Thomas laughed. He had this laugh, it started in his whole body before it got to his face. I thought, that's a man who is honest about what delights him. She stopped. The fire crackled. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Edgar said. "He was," she said, and then simply, "I miss him every hour." "You don't have to not say that," Edgar said. "Not around me." She looked at him. There was something relieving about it, about the permission to grieve plainly. She had been managing her grief around others so carefully, performing the appropriate amount of sadness without excess, remaining functional and clear, because that was what was required of her. Here, by this fire, with this man who was watching her with honest attention and not a trace of pity, she could simply say it. "I know that grief doesn't have a timetable," she said. "I know that whatever I feel about whatever comes next, that doesn't diminish what came before." She had not planned to say that last part. The whatever comes next hung in the air between them, and she felt the warmth of the fire on her face and did not look at him for a moment. When she did, he was looking into the fire again, and his expression was composed but not closed, which meant he had heard it and was holding it carefully. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They arrived in Wichita in the early afternoon of the second day, and Edgar took them directly to the offices of Judge Randall Whitmore, who was a lean, precise man of 60, with the face of someone who had spent decades separating the honest from the dishonest, and had formed certain durable opinions in the process. He received them without ceremony, looked at the evidence with the same kind of unhurried thoroughness Edgar had employed at the ravine, listened to Hector's testimony, and read Thomas's letter twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at Edgar. "You understand what you're doing," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Edgar said. "The Delacroix family has resources and attorneys and 40 years of political relationships in this county and the next too." "Yes, sir." "And you're prepared to see this through regardless." "We're prepared," Edgar said, and he said we're in a way that folded Henrietta into it so naturally and completely that she felt it as a physical thing, a standing beside her. Whitmore looked at Henrietta directly for the first time. "Mrs. Winslow, the legal process I'm going to initiate will be unpleasant. It will be public, and people will say things about your husband and about you. Are you prepared for that?" "Judge Whitmore," she said, "I have been prepared for unpleasant since the morning I found my husband was dead," and the official response was to shrug. Something moved in Whitmore's face that might have been the beginning of a smile, controlled before it arrived. "Very well," he said. He issued a warrant for the arrest of Clarence Delacroix for investigation into the death of Thomas Winslow, to be carried out not by Sheriff Purvis, but by the county marshal, a man named Briggs who operated out of Wichita and who answered to the circuit court rather than to local politics. He designated Edgar as his official representative in the matter, which gave Edgar the legal standing to operate in Caldwell without Purvis's cooperation. The process that followed was not fast. Legal processes in 1878 Kansas were not fast under any circumstances, and when they involved wealthy and connected men, they moved with an additional layer of friction that required patience and stubbornness in equal measure. But Henrietta had both. She and Edgar rode back to Caldwell. Marshal Briggs followed with 2 deputies to make the arrest. Clarence Delacroix was brought in from the ranch with a look of cold fury that Henrietta watched through the window of the boarding house. And the sight of it, the entitled outrage of a man who had never genuinely expected to be held accountable, did something to settle the thing in her chest that had been unsettled for 53 days. Purvis came out of his office, and there was a very brief and ugly confrontation on the street between him and Marshal Briggs that ended with Briggs showing him the warrant and Purvis going back inside. His relationship with the circuit court became, very shortly thereafter, something that required significant review. The trial, when it came, was held in Wichita in the spring of 1879, after a winter of preparation and witness gathering, and the kind of legal maneuvering that Edgar navigated with a persistent and unglamorous competence. He spent most of that winter in and out of Caldwell gathering testimony, tracking down people who had seen or heard things they had been afraid to say while Purvis ran the county. He spent time at Henrietta's land, too, because she needed help with the ranch through the winter and she was not too proud to accept it, and because the ranch itself was part of the evidence of Thomas's life and what had been taken from it, and keeping it going through the cold months felt important to both of them. Those winter months were when she came to know him properly. He was quiet in a way that was not emptiness but fullness. There was a great deal going on behind the stillness, and the more time she spent near him, the more she could read it. He was funny, in a dry and understated way that crept up on her. He had opinions about books, which surprised her, until she learned that his mother had given him a love of reading that had survived everything else that had failed. He could cook reasonably well and did not consider it beneath him. He was good with her horses in the way that genuine horsemen are, with an ease and a respect that the animals understood and responded to. He was also sometimes consumed by a darkness that she could see from a distance but did not press at, because she recognized it as a version of the thing she carried herself, the weight of grief and guilt, and the particular exhaustion of people who have seen too much of what the world does with the vulnerable. On the evenings when it was heavy on him, she simply sat near him and let it be, and she noticed that the nearness seemed to help, and she was glad of it. She also noticed, with a clarity that increased as the winter progressed, that she was falling in love with him. It arrived not as a sudden thing but as an accumulation of small and specific recognitions. The way her day was organized, she realized, around whether she would see him. The way his opinion about a thing mattered to her in a way that other people's opinions did not. The way she sometimes caught herself watching his hands when he worked and felt warmth that had nothing to do with the task he was performing. The way she knew the sound of his horse on the road before she could see it, and that the knowing of it changed something in her breathing. She did not do anything about any of this. It was too soon, and he was her ally in a serious business, and she was still carrying Thomas's absence like a stone in her pocket, heavy and real. She simply let it be what it was and carried it alongside the other things she was carrying. He felt it too. She was fairly certain of that. She had seen it in the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, in the way his caution around her had a quality of effort to it, as if the distance he maintained was not natural but chosen. She respected the choice. It told her something good about him. She had also written to Thomas's younger brother, Samuel, who lived in St. Louis, to tell him what had happened and what she was doing about it. Samuel had written back with a letter that had made her cry for an hour, expressing a grief that matched hers and a gratitude that she found both touching and uncomfortable. He asked her to tell him how the trial went. She promised she would. The trial opened in April of 1879. The Delacroix family's attorneys were expensive and skilled, and the proceedings had the quality of a battle conducted in the language of the law, which was a battlefield Henrietta had not grown up on, and which she navigated with the help of Judge Whitmore's referrals to a Wichita attorney named Charles Osberg, who had handled cases against powerful interests before, and who seemed to find the evidence against Clarence Delacroix both sufficient and satisfying. She sat in the courtroom every day of the 10-day trial. She sat straight and still and watched everything with the attention she had applied to all of it since the beginning. Hector Villanueva testified, and did so with a quiet clarity and dignity that the Delacroix attorneys attempted to undermine through the usual means: his character, his heritage, his motives, and that the jury, to her relief, appeared to regard as the testimony of an honest man rather than a convenient one. Edgar testified about the physical evidence and the investigation, and did so with the methodical thoroughness she had come to expect from him. Mrs. Polk testified about the letter Thomas had left. The bootmaker's widow from Wichita, reached through correspondence, provided a signed statement about the specific defect in the left heel of the boots made for Clarence Delacroix. The plaster mold matched the boot. On the 10th day, the jury found Clarence Delacroix guilty of the murder of Thomas Winslow. Henrietta sat very still when they read it. She had told herself she would not cry. She cried. She let herself briefly, because it was the first time since Thomas died that she had been in a room where the truth had been officially acknowledged, where the world had looked at what had happened to her husband and said, yes, this was wrong, yes, this was real, yes, this man should pay for it. The relief of it, even in the middle of the grief, was enormous. She felt Edgar's hand on hers on the bench beside her, warm and steady, and she turned it over and held it, and neither of them said anything. Clarence Delacroix was sentenced to a long prison term. His father, old Marcus Delacroix, sat in the gallery through the sentencing with the face of a man watching an entire era of his life collapse, which it was. The family's political power did not survive the scandal cleanly. Sheriff Purvis resigned his position 3 weeks after the verdict, which was not specifically required of him, but which everyone understood was the appropriate response to the review of his conduct that Judge Whitmore had initiated. She rode back to her land after the trial with a feeling that was not simple. Justice was not the same as healing, and the courtroom was not the same as getting Thomas back, and she had known that, and still the reality of it sat heavily. But it was done, and it was right, and she could stand on the land that Thomas had loved and look at it without the injustice of it twisting inside her like a knife. Edgar rode out to the ranch the week after the trial. She had known he would come, and she had spent a day telling herself this meant nothing, and then stopped wasting her energy on that particular effort. He came up the road in the late afternoon, and she was on the porch, and the light was that spring evening gold that turned the prairie grass to copper and made everything look the way things looked in memory. She watched him ride up and thought, there he is, with a simplicity and a completeness that she recognized for what it was. He tied his horse at the post and came up to the porch and stood there, hat in his hands, which she recognized from Thomas's description as the position men assumed when they had something to say that mattered to them. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I'm better," she said. "Come in and have some coffee." He came in and they sat at the kitchen table where she had spent so many evenings with Thomas, and she made coffee and set it down between them, and it was comfortable and familiar in a way that a month ago would have seemed impossible given that she had known him for less than a year. "What are you doing next?" he asked. "Staying here," she said. "Running the land. Thomas's brother Samuel has offered to come out and help manage it, which I appreciate. I think I want to keep it going. Not because I feel obligated, but because I love it. I've spent 7 years learning to love this specific piece of ground, and I don't see any reason to give it up." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking into his coffee, and after that he said, the directness of the question, or rather the direction it was pointing, made her chest warm. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I'd like to find out." He looked up at her. "Henrietta," he said, and the use of her first name, which he had been careful about all winter, had the quality of a deliberate step. "Edgar," she said. He set down his coffee mug. There are things I want to say. I've been waiting to say them because the time wasn't right, and I'm still not entirely certain the time is right now, but I find I'm not able to keep them entirely to myself any longer." "Then say them," she said. "I think you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known," he said. "Not in the easy way that men say things like that. I mean it specifically. The way you built that case, the way you carried yourself through all of it, the way you are on this land and in this kitchen and sitting by a fire and in a courtroom, I've been paying attention. And what I've seen is someone who is entirely herself in every situation, and that's not a common thing. I know the timing is complicated, and I know that you're still grieving, and I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I'm asking you only to know that what I feel for you is real and serious and not going anywhere." She looked at him across the table. The evening light was coming through the window and it was on his face, and she thought, "I am going to remember this exact moment." "I know it's real," she said. "I've known it for some time. I've been watching you watch me when you think I'm not watching." A slight, involuntary smile at the corner of her mouth. "You're not as discreet as you think." The look on his face at that was something she treasured, surprised, and then embarrassed, and then something that was warm and open in a way she had not seen on him before. "I've been trying to be respectful," he said. "You've been respectful," she said, "and patient, and present. And all the winter you were here when I was grieving and difficult and sometimes not good company, you were." She stopped. "You were exactly what was needed, consistently, without making a performance of it." "I didn't want to be a performance," he said. "I just wanted to be useful." "You were more than useful," she said. "Edgar." She reached across the table and put her hand over his the way he had put his hand on hers in the courtroom. "I am still grieving. I will be for a while. And I want to be honest with you about that because you've been honest with me about everything and you deserve the same." She paused. "But I want you to stay." He turned his hand under hers and held it. His grip was warm and sure. "I intend to," he said. The spring moved into summer, and the ranch came alive the way the prairie always did in June, in the particular explosive way of a land that had spent half the year in restraint. Samuel Winslow arrived from St. Louis in late May. He was 28, dark-eyed and angular like Thomas had been, and there was a painful warmth in meeting him, in seeing the family resemblance in the set of his jaw and the way he stood, that settled into something gentler over the days of that first week as she came to know him as himself. Samuel was good with the land and good with the cattle, and had a ready humor that lifted the mood of the place. He took immediately to Edgar, who treated him with a straightforward respect that did not require Samuel to perform his relationship to the land or his place on it, and the two men fell into an easy partnership of work that ran the ranch through the summer months with a competence that allowed Henrietta to breathe. She and Edgar moved slowly and honestly into something that had no need to be rushed, because it was already clear to both of them that it was not going away. They rode together in the early mornings, which was her favorite time on the land, when the light came sideways across the grass, and the hawks were still, and the world had not yet organized itself into the demands of the day. He read to her some evenings. He had a small collection of books in his saddlebag that had accumulated over years of circuit riding, and he read well, with a quiet expressiveness that made the words land properly. She told him about her life before Thomas, the Philadelphia house, the schoolteacher father and the mother who had played piano with a determination that outstripped her talent, but that filled the house with a sound that was always attempting to be more than it was, which she had loved. She told him about arriving in Kansas and finding it frightening, and then finding it magnificent. She told him about the early years of the marriage, the hard years of building, the way she and Thomas had argued and made peace, and built something together that was more than either of them had come to it with. He listened to all of it, and what she valued was that he listened to the Thomas parts without a trace of the discomfort that some men would have shown, without any subtle pulling of her attention back from the past and toward him. He seemed to understand that her history was not his competition. It was her foundation. By late summer, the thing between them had the quality of a certainty. Not the breathless and astonished certainty of the young, but the calmer and perhaps deeper certainty of people who have looked at a thing from all its angles and recognized that it is solid. It was a Sunday evening in August, sitting on the porch while the sun went down in the extravagant way it did over the Kansas plain, that he said, "I'd like to marry you, Henrietta, when you're ready. Not as a proposal with a deadline, but as a statement of what I want, so you know it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had taken to doing on evenings like this, and felt the solidity of him. "I'm ready now," she said. "I've been ready for a little while. I was waiting to be sure you weren't asking out of some sense of—" "It's not out of any sense of duty," he said. "It is entirely and specifically because I love you and I want to build something with you, and I have never wanted anything this clearly in my life." "Then yes," she said. "Edgar Kendrick, yes." He turned toward her and took her face in those large, careful hands and kissed her, and it was the first time they had kissed. And it was everything she had been not quite allowing herself to imagine, warm and honest and deliberate, as everything about him was. They were married in September of 1879 in the small church at the edge of Caldwell, which had a new pastor that year, following the reorganization of the town's civic life in the wake of the Delacroix trial. It was a simple ceremony with a modest gathering: Samuel, Mrs. Polk, Hector Villanueva and his wife Maria, a few of the neighboring ranchers who had watched the events of the past year with respect and sympathy, and Judge Whitmore, who had ridden out from Wichita and sat in the front row with an expression of dignified satisfaction. Henrietta wore a dress of deep green wool, not the black of mourning, not the white of a girl's first, because she was who she was, and she arrived at this marriage as herself, not as a blank page. Edgar wore his best coat and the particular expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and is determined not to waste it. Samuel walked her down the aisle because she had asked him to, which was not the traditional way of doing things, but she had spent enough of her life doing things the traditional way when the traditional way was not the honest way. She spoke her vows clearly and looked at Edgar while she said them, and he looked at her while he said his, and there was nothing performed or managed about any of it. Afterward, there was a gathering at the ranch food that Mrs. Polk and Maria Villanueva had organized with a thoroughness that suggested they had been planning it significantly longer than anyone had officially acknowledged, and music from a fiddler who had a light and skipping style that made even Samuel, who danced badly and knew it, take a turn. Edgar danced with her slowly and correctly, and she found that he moved with the same quality he brought to everything, a quiet and unhurried grace. The new circuit judge who had been appointed to cover Caldwell's district rode out to pay his respects in the late afternoon, and to tell Edgar, with a considerable amount of careful language, that if he was interested in the formal position of county marshal for the district, the appointment was there for him. Edgar said he would think about it and later told Henrietta that he would take it because it would mean staying in one place for the first time in 6 years, and he found that he wanted to stay in this place with her. "Are you sure?" she asked. "The circuit, the riding, the freedom, was what I needed when I needed it," he said. "This is what I need now." The winter of their first year together was different from the previous winter, and the difference was not simply the formal change of their status, but something in the quality of the daily life they were making. It was the small and accumulated things: the mornings when she woke to the smell of his coffee already on the stove, the evenings when they sat on either side of the fire with their respective books, and the silence between them was its own kind of conversation, the cold nights when he was warm beside her, and the darkness was simply darkness, and not the enormous and crushing thing it had been when she was alone in it. Samuel stayed through the winter and announced in the spring that he intended to stay permanently, that he had been offered a position helping manage the land records office in Caldwell, and that he felt, being where his brother had lived, and where his brother's memory was tended by people who had loved him, something like the right place. Henrietta was quietly glad. It was good to have that thread of Thomas kept alive in a living, practical way. By the second spring of their marriage, Henrietta knew she was expecting a child. She told Edgar on a morning in April when the meadowlarks were back and the grass was the particular young green of a prairie April, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before: surprise, and then a flooding warmth that he did not try to manage or contain. He held her carefully and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm better than well." "Boy or girl?" he said, which was not really a question, and then, "I don't suppose you know." "I don't suppose I do," she said, laughing a little, "but I think it might be a boy." It was. William Thomas Kendrick was born in November of 1880. A fact of the matter kind of arrival that he carried out with the no-nonsense efficiency that suggested a personality that would be neither dramatic nor easy. He arrived with a quantity of dark hair and the focused and somewhat suspicious expression of a person who has found himself in an unexpected situation and is taking stock. They named him William for Edgar's father and Thomas for the man whose land he would grow up on, and Henrietta held him in the first hours and thought about all the things she wanted to tell him when he was old enough to hear them. About his father, Edgar, who had looked at a bag full of evidence that nobody wanted and said, quietly and clearly, that he wanted it. About his name's sake, Thomas, who had loved a piece of land and a woman with a whole and unguarded heart, and who deserved to be remembered as the man who had made this place possible. About the fact that the world did not always do right by people, and that there were choices you made about what to do with that fact. Edgar's work as county marshal kept him busy, but crucially kept him nearby. The position suited him in the way that honest work suits a person who is constitutionally unable to do anything other than their best. He brought to it the same patience and thoroughness he had brought to everything, and the community came slowly but genuinely to trust him, which mattered to both of them. He was particularly attentive to the cases that involved people without power, the small ranchers squeezed by larger interests, the workers taken advantage of by employers who assumed no one was watching, the instances of the old and continuing injustices of land and race that the Wild West performed as casually as breathing. He could not fix all of it. He was honest about what he could and could not do, but he did what he could, consistently, and that was not nothing. Hector Villanueva and his wife Maria became genuine friends, not the careful social kind but the kind who came for dinner and stayed late and said difficult true things and could be counted on entirely. Hector had found work as a foreman for a neighboring ranch whose owner had the sense to recognize competence, and he and Maria were building a life of their own that had the particular quality of things reclaimed from what had tried to take them. The ranch prospered. Not extravagantly. It was a working ranch in the 1880s Kansas, and it demanded what working ranches demanded, but genuinely. Samuel's help and Edgar's practical knowledge and Henrietta's understanding of the land and her absolute refusal to make decisions based on fear rather than sense made a combination that was stronger than any of its parts. In the summer of 1882, Henrietta found she was expecting again. This time she told Edgar in the evening, sitting on the porch where so many of the important things had been said, and he looked at her with an expression so warm and unguarded that she had to look away briefly, overwhelmed by it in the way that particular kind of happiness overwhelmed her. "William is going to be appalled," Edgar said. "He's just gotten used to being the sole authority." William, who was a year and a half and had taken a vigorous proprietary position on most aspects of the household, was in fact somewhat appalled when a sister arrived the following spring. Clara Josephine Kendrick came in March of 1883 with considerably more ceremony than her brother had employed, which established immediately a difference in their natures that would continue to entertain their parents for years. She arrived with eyes that were already looking for something specific and expressed an early and persistent interest in being carried by Edgar, who accommodated this with a helpless and obvious delight. Henrietta watched her husband walk the floor with the baby against his shoulder on the third night, in the way new fathers do, and thought about all the roads that had led here. The road from Philadelphia to Kansas, the road from Thomas's death to the sheriff's office, the road from that office into the careful and extraordinary life she was now living, the roads that Edgar had ridden for 6 years before finding this particular place, the way coincidence and courage and the stubbornness of justice had brought them all to this kitchen, to this house, to this life. William toddled out of his room at some point in that third night and stood in the doorway and looked at his father pacing with the baby and said, with the solemnity of a child who has decided to tolerate a situation, "She's loud." "She is," Edgar agreed in a low voice. "Is she going to stay loud?" "Probably." William considered this. "Okay," he said, with the philosophical resignation of a person who recognizes when a fact is a fact, and turned around and went back to bed. Henrietta pressed her face against her pillow and laughed until she had to stop because laughing hurt. The years folded into each other in the way that good years do, each one distinguishable by its events, but all of them carrying a common thread of warmth that made the whole, looked back on, feel like a single sustained thing. Clara grew into a child of fierce intelligence and bottomless curiosity who asked. From the earliest age she could form the sentences, questions about everything, the land, the sky, the way things worked, the history of the place she lived in, why some people were treated differently than others. Henrietta and Edgar answered her honestly, as they had agreed to do. The honest answers were not always simple, but a child who received simple answers to complex questions grew up unprepared for the actual world, and neither of them was interested in that. William grew, by contrast, into a child of deep and quiet observation, watchful in the way his father was watchful, interested in the land's details, attached to the horses, given to long silences that were full rather than empty. He and his sister argued with the intensity that only siblings can muster, and were devoted to each other with the completeness that only siblings can achieve, which Edgar watched with a satisfaction that Henrietta found deeply moving. Thomas's grave was on the land, on a slight rise to the east from which you could see a good distance across the prairie, the way Thomas had always liked to see. She brought flowers in the spring and visited it through the year, and she brought the children with her when they were old enough to understand what it was about. She told them about Thomas, not as a substitute father or a saint, but as a man she had loved, who had loved this land, and who was part of the reason it was theirs to tend. She told them about what had happened to him and what she had done about it, not in a way meant to frighten them, but in a way meant to give them information about the world and about what people could do in it. Edgar told them too, in his own way, and she loved him for the way he did it, without minimizing Thomas or his own role in what had happened, without the ego that a lesser man might have brought to the story. He told them that Thomas Winslow had been a good man who had done nothing wrong and been killed for it, and that the job of the people who loved him was to make sure the truth was known. He told them that the job of everyone was to look at what was wrong and say it was wrong, even when it was inconvenient. In the spring of 1885, a letter arrived from a legal firm in Wichita informing her that the Delacroix land holdings, significantly reduced in value through the scandal and the legal costs of the trial and its aftermath, had been put up for sale in several parcels. One of the parcels was adjacent to her eastern fence line. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time, thinking about what Thomas would have wanted and what she wanted and what Edgar thought, and then she went out to find Edgar in the barn. He read the letter and looked up at her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to buy it," she said. "Not because I want more. Because it was taken from people it belonged to, and the cycle of that doesn't end unless someone interrupts it." He nodded slowly. "It's a fair amount of money." "I know what it costs," she said. He handed the letter back to her. "Then let's buy it," he said. They bought the parcel, and they used the additional land to expand the range for the cattle, and they hired 2 additional hands, one of whom was a young man named Theo Graybear, whose mother was from the Kansas people and whose father had been a trapper, and who needed work and proved to be, within 3 months, one of the best hands on the ranch. He became part of the household's life in the easy and unforced way that good people do, and the children adored him, and he repaid that adoration by teaching them things about the land that supplemented what they already knew with a whole additional grammar of understanding. Judge Whitmore retired in 1886 and wrote Henrietta and Edgar a letter on the occasion of his retirement that she framed and kept on the wall of the kitchen. It said, among other things, that in 30 years on the bench the case of Thomas Winslow's death was one of the ones he was most satisfied by, not because the outcome was easy but because it was right, and because it had been made possible by the stubbornness of a widow who had refused to accept what everyone was prepared to tell her. He expressed his admiration clearly and without sentiment, which was entirely in keeping with what she knew of him. Edgar had his own satisfactions, quieter ones. He had built the county marshal's office into something that the community genuinely respected, which was not a given and not an accident. He had done it by being exactly who he was, consistently, without performance or political calculation. When the county grew and the position's responsibilities expanded, he expanded to meet them, and he did it without losing the quality of specific attention to specific people's specific situations that had made him good at the job from the beginning. He and Henrietta argued, as married people do. Not about fundamental things, but about the ordinary textures of life, money and time and decisions, and the thousand small negotiations of 2 strong-willed people sharing a life. He was sometimes too certain, and she told him so. She was sometimes too self-sufficient, meaning she did not ask for help when she needed it, and he told her so. They had developed, over the years, the ability to say these things honestly and hear them without the defensive anger that made honesty useless. It had not been easy to develop this. It had required repeated and sometimes uncomfortable practice, and the occasional evening of cold silence before the better impulse won. On their 10th wedding anniversary in September of 1889, he gave her a book, a particular edition of a collection of natural philosophy writings that she had mentioned once, in passing, years before, as something she had always wanted to read. She looked at the book and looked at him, and understood that he had been carrying the knowledge of that casual mention for years, waiting for the right occasion, which was such a specific and characteristic expression of how he loved that she felt it in the same place. She always felt the things that mattered most. She gave him the deed to a piece of land she had quietly arranged, using money saved carefully over the previous year, a small parcel to the north of the ranch that had a spring on it, and a view of the kind that made the world look the way it was supposed to look when it was doing its best. She had asked Theo Greybear to help her identify the right piece, on the principle that Theo knew the land's character better than anyone. She told Edgar it was his, specifically, no one else's, a place that was his own ground in the way that every person deserved to have ground that was theirs. He stood on the porch that evening and she watched him look at the land spreading out in the late September light, William and Clara somewhere out in it, Samuel's light already on in the bunkhouse, the smell of the dinner she had made coming through the door behind them, and she saw on his face something she thought about for the rest of her life when she needed to remember what it looked like when a person was entirely and simply content. "Henrietta," he said. "Edgar," she said. He turned and held out his hand and she took it, and they stood there together looking at the land in the last of the day's light, and there was nothing left to say. Or rather, there was everything, and it was all already said, in the standing there, in the holding of hands, in the life that was woven around them and into them and between them like something so thoroughly grown into the structure of things that it could not be separated from it without taking everything else apart. The years continued. William grew tall and quiet, and at 17 announced that he intended to study land surveying, which made Henrietta think of her father and made Edgar say nothing but look at her with the particular expression of a man who finds the patterns of love deeply satisfying. Clara at 15 was already the most academically inclined person on the ranch and had decided, with the certainty of a person who has never seriously doubted their own judgment, that she intended to become a doctor. Henrietta told her to be prepared for the world to resist this. Clara said she was aware of that and intended to proceed regardless, which was so recognizable that Henrietta had to leave the room to compose herself. By the early 1890s, Caldwell itself had changed considerably from the raw and compromised place it had been when Henrietta had walked into the sheriff's office with her leather satchel. The cattle trail era was winding down, the railroad had reconfigured the economics of the region, and the town had settled into something more permanent and less volatile. The characters of the old arrangement were mostly gone or changed. Purvis had gone east and opened a hardware store and was never mentioned in the company Henrietta kept. The Delacroix family name appeared occasionally in property records, but as a diminishing presence, the great accumulation of their power having been comprehensively redistributed by time and consequence. The new courthouse that was built in Caldwell in 1890 had a plaque on its entrance hall listing significant cases in the county's legal history, and Thomas Winslow's name was among them, described as a matter that had established the obligation of the court to investigate regardless of the social standing of the accused. It was a formal and slightly bloodless way of putting it, but it was there in stone, and she stood before it once and felt Thomas in the warmth of a late afternoon October sunlight that came through the courthouse windows at exactly the angle that made her think of autumn and open ground and a man on a horse who had known this land like his own hands. "He'd be embarrassed by a plaque," Edgar said, standing beside her. "He would," she agreed. "He'd say the cattle needed tending." They walked out of the courthouse together into the Caldwell Street, and it was not the same street it had been. The boards were more settled, the businesses more established, the faces more familiar and less transient, and she looked at it with the affection that comes from having a history with a place, from having been part of what it had made itself into. She reached for Edgar's hand and he gave it to her readily, as he had done for 12 years of walking through the world together. She thought about the morning she had walked into the sheriff's office with a leather satchel pressed against her chest and dust on her morning dress, knowing no one would help her. She thought about the way the world had arranged itself against her, which was not unusual and was not personal, which was simply what the world did with its thumb on its familiar scales. She thought about the man who had been leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, paying close attention to something everyone else had already dismissed. He had said, simply and directly, that he wanted to see what was in the bag. That there was a man who wanted a thing that no one else would take was still, 12 years later, what it had always been, a fact about Edgar Kendrick's character so fundamental and clear that it organized everything that had come after it. She held his hand in the Caldwell street in the October afternoon, and the town moved around them in its ordinary and specific life, and somewhere behind them on the road east was the ranch with the land that Thomas had loved and that she kept, and that her children were growing up on, and all of it held together in the web of consequence that ran back to the satchel and the office and the man who had said he wanted to see. "Come home," she said. "Yes," he said, and they walked together to their horses and rode east into the afternoon. William finished his surveying studies in 1897 and came home to work on the land he had grown up on, bringing with him a quiet and steadfast wife named Anna, whose people were from Nebraska, and who took to the ranch with a practical competence that Henrietta recognized as kindred. They built a small house on the northwest corner of the property, which became its own warm presence in the life of the place. Clara, true to her word and her nature, studied medicine, which required both travel and fighting, as Henrietta had warned her, and which she accomplished both with a persistence that was recognizable as a family trait. She completed her training in 1898, which was not a common thing for a woman and which was a hard one thing in every sense, and she established a practice in a neighboring county town that needed a doctor badly, and was, by that point, less resistant to the gender of the one it had than an earlier era might have been. Edgar's hair went mostly gray in his late 50s, which suited him in the way that gray suited men who had been paying attention all their lives. He moved with the same quality of unhurried deliberateness he had always had, and the darkness that had occasionally taken him in the years she had first known him was mostly quieter now, visited less frequently, and held more easily when it did come, because he had learned, as people do when loved well for a long time, that it could be acknowledged without being obeyed. He retired from the marshal's position in 1895 at 60, and the retirement gathering that the town held for him was one of the most honest expressions of genuine communal respect she had ever seen, which meant more than the formal kind, because it came from people who had actually experienced him, and not simply from people who were meant to honor the position. Afterward, he simply worked the ranch with William and tended his small northern parcel with a careful private attention, and he read, and he was present in the way that a man is present who has come to understand that presence is not nothing, but in fact the main thing. They grew old together in the way she had hoped for without always believing it was possible honestly, with specific mutual admiration, with the daily practice of choosing each other that was not a grand gesture but a series of small and ordinary ones, the coffee and the books and the evening porch and the hand held in the street. With the grief carried honestly, too, because a life without grief is a life that has not loved anyone, and theirs had loved much and lost some, and held the losses with the same hands that held everything else. On a September evening in the new century, in the first years of what was already being called a new era, but which looked, from the porch of a Kansas ranch, rather like the continuation of the particular and irreplaceable one she had lived in, she sat beside Edgar and watched the sunset do what it did best over the flat and enormous country, and William and Anna's voices came from the house down the slope, and Clara would ride up the following week from her practice with the news, as yet unspoken, that Henrietta had suspected for 3 months and was waiting to hear confirmed. She looked at Edgar. He was looking at the sunset with the same attention he gave to everything. "Are you happy?" she asked, because after all this time she still wanted to know, still found the question worth asking. He looked at her. The light was on his face, and she knew this face as well as she knew the land, knew every line of it and what it meant and how it moved. "More than I know how to say," he said. "Then say it anyway," she said, imperfectly. He thought about this which she loved. He looked back at the sunset for a moment and then looked at her again. "I was riding circuit for 6 years looking at the country," he said, and it was beautiful country and I loved it, but I was looking at it from the outside, like a man looking through a window at something warm. He paused. I walked in through that window when I walked into that sheriff's office that morning. I have been inside ever since. I do not intend to leave. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The prairie went on as it did, enormous and golden and impervious and magnificent, holding everything that had happened on it and everything that would, keeping the grass and the wind and the slow, long memory of a land that had always told the truth if you knew how to ask it. She knew how to ask it. She had learned from her father, and she had learned from Thomas, and she had learned from Edgar, and she had learned from the land itself, which was the oldest teacher. The evening settled. The stars began. She took his hand in the dark, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch that Thomas had loved and that she had kept and that their children would inherit. And the night came on full and warm around them, and everything was exactly as it was, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the whole of what a life could hold.